20,000 years ago, humans lived alongside creatures so massive that a single mammoth could feed an entire tribe for months. Yet these giants vanished so completely that we've only recently discovered some of them buried in the permafrost, with their last meals still in their stomachs. The Ice Age wasn't just a period of cold weather, it was the most recent chapter in Earth's history, where megafauna ruled the planet, where ice sheets 2 miles thick buried entire continents, and where our own species nearly went extinct multiple times before emerging as the dominant force we are today. Most people think they know the Ice Age. They picture woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers from movies and museum displays. But the real story is far stranger and more profound than Hollywood ever imagined. This wasn't just one ice age, but a series of dramatic climate swings that lasted over 2 million years, fundamentally reshaping not just the landscape, but the entire course of evolution itself. Understanding this period isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding how quickly our planet's climate can change, how resilient life can be under extreme conditions, and why the world we live in today looks exactly the way it does. Tonight, we're going to journey back to a world where ice sheets stretched from the Arctic to New York City, where giant ground sloths the size of cars browsed in forests that would later become the Amazon, and where early humans developed the tools and strategies that would eventually allow them to dominate the planet. We'll discover why some of the largest animals that ever lived went extinct just as human civilization was beginning, explore the bizarre creatures that thrived in this frozen world, and uncover the climate patterns that could teach us crucial lessons about our own future. You'll learn about the mysterious Younger Dryas event that plunged the world back into Ice Age conditions in less than a decade, meet the cave lions and giant beavers that once ruled landscapes we thought we knew, and understand how this seemingly harsh and barren world actually became the crucible that forged modern humanity. But first we need to understand what an ice age really is, because it's not what most people think. Perhaps we begin not with a blizzard, but with a definition. Quiet, careful, almost like tracing a snowflake with your eye as it drifts past the firelight. An ice age, in the language of geologists, isn't a single storm or even a single long winter. It is a chapter of deep time in which ice is a persistent neighbour, when great sheets of it can endure on continents for tens of thousands of years, and polar caps refuse to retreat entirely, even when summers arrive. Within such a chapter there are gentler pages and harsher ones, warmer interludes and renewed freezes, glacial periods and interglacials, breathing in and out, over cycles that might span tens of millennia. We live, many scientists suggest, inside the tail of one such chapter. Even now, the polar ice has never fully left. The great continental sheets that once sprawled across the north have mostly melted back. Yes, but remnants cling to Greenland, to Antarctica, like the last embers of a vast cold fire. So when people say the Ice Age, they are often pointing to the most recent dramatic passages of this ongoing era, the Pleistocene, beginning roughly 2.6 million years ago, and the softer, greener page that followed, the Holocene, beginning a little more than 11,000 years ago, which may be considered a warm breath within a longer cold story. If that sounds paradoxical, an ice age that includes warm intervals, imagine a heartbeat you can barely hear, a slow rhythm written not in seconds but in centuries, in the tilt of Earth's axis, in the wobble of its spin, in the stretch and squeeze of its orbit. Those celestial nudges, often grouped under the name Milankovitch cycles, seem to set the stage for the pulse. How much sunlight warms high northern summers, how long winters can gather snow that doesn't quite melt, how ice, once seeded, brightens the planet and reflects light away, cooling things more, inviting more ice, a feedback that may whisper, then suddenly sings. But a definition without a feeling is dry. So let's close our eyes and consider what it might have meant to stand at the margin of a continental ice sheet. The air would have tasted clean, almost metallic. The light would feel filtered, as if passing through glass. A horizon not of mountains but of frozen motion, a wall that creeps with the patience of stone. And beneath your feet, the land would be telling you that ice has weight. It presses continents down as a hand presses clay. It grinds bedrock into flour-fine dust. It writes with boulders. It sets rivers on new errands and leaves subtle punctuation marks, moraines, eskers, drumlins, across a page of earth that seems at first glance to be just quiet fields. When we say the ice was 2 miles thick, we are speaking in approximations, in echoes of measurements taken from ancient shorelines, from trapped bubbles in polar cores, from the shape of the land itself. The numbers might vary, thickness here, thinner there, but the image is steady, a ceiling of cold, a slow avalanche frozen into a plateau, stretching beyond sight. In North America, one sheet, often called the Laurentide, may have reached down past what is now the Great Lakes, lapping at the region that would one day be New York. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice held northern Europe in its palm. Elsewhere, alpine glaciers braided like silver hair across mountains. In the far south, Antarctica kept its own counsel under the wind. Yet even as ice dominated, life threaded through. An ice age is not a single environment. It is a patchwork, harsh here, surprisingly gentle there. Along the margins of the sheets, tundra and cold steppe might have blown with feathered grasses and dwarf shrubs. Beyond that, where winds laid down lowest like pages of pale dust, hardy herbivores grazed, and predators kept a careful, wary grace. In certain refuges, forests withdrew but did not disappear. Rivers kept their liquid spine even as their banks froze, and all around, the sea was different, drawn down as water locked up on land. Coastlines marched outward. Shelves that are now drowned were then the open world, land bridges, broad plains, new routes for wanderers who did not yet know they were crossing into history. If we zoom out further, the very phrase the Ice Age may mislead. There were many glacial advances and retreats, many pulses. The last great cold crest, the one many of us picture, peaked perhaps around 20 to 26,000 years ago, give or take a few breaths of time. But earlier crests and valleys in this climate rhythm had already sculpted continents, redirected rivers, seeded soils. Some lasted longer, some rose and fell more sharply. The Earth's climate, it seems, is not a metronome, more like a tide, stirred by distant moons, by continental arrangements, by greenhouse gases breathing in and out with oceans and volcanoes, and living things. All this matters because words shape our imagination. If we imagine the Ice Age as a single unbroken freeze, we miss the motion, the drama, the living edge, where change is fastest. If we imagine it as a sudden catastrophe, we may forget that it unfolded with a patience both terrible and beautiful, that an inch of ice built each year becomes a mile in time, that a degree of warmth or coolness, held steady across centuries, can redraw the world. And if we imagine it as far away, we miss the way it lingers in us. In the stories humans told at the mouths of caves, in the tools they made, bone and stone shaped for cold hands, in the patterns of our genes that may have whispered of old bottlenecks and narrow paths through harsh seasons, perhaps even in the comfort we find by firelight, in the hush that descends when snow begins to fall. Before we step deeper, if you're still awake with us in this quiet, I'd love to hear from you, gently in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Late afternoon? Midnight? Are you tucked in a room with the lights low, or studying late with a mug cooling beside you, or maybe walking under a street lamp's small halo? Leave a simple note if you like. It's a way of mapping our own little climate, this calm weather we make together. Returning now to the idea of naming. Geologists often speak of epochs and stages, Pleistocene, Holocene, useful labels for shelves in the library of time. But people living within those shelves would not have found the labels helpful. They would have known winter and summer, hunger and plenty, ice advancing or retreating, animals following grass. They might have understood in a practical way that the world had moods, slow moods, long moods, that perhaps a grandparent could sense shifting across a lifetime. They might have noticed lakes growing larger, then draining away, boulders appearing as if delivered by giants, beaches far inland that bore the memory of an ocean, now walked as grassland. So when we say what counts as an ice age, maybe it's this: a prolonged habit of the earth, a tendency toward cold that never quite leaves, underwritten by cycles in the sky and feedbacks on the ground, expressed in ice that breathes in and out, shaping the lives of all who share the air. And with that outline in mind, we can begin to map the stage, to see where the glass lay over the land, to picture shorelines farther out, valleys deeper, mountains sharper, and to glimpse the routes by which both beasts and people threaded the white. For now, let the wind grow soft. The next chapter will be a long, quiet walk over ancient maps, coastlines sleeping under today's waves, names written in the alphabet of ice. Imagine unrolling a translucent sheet over a globe, not opaque, not absolute, but shimmering, with thicknesses that pool in basins of cold. This is one way to hold in mind the world as ice reached its wider extents. Not every valley froze, not every forest vanished. Yet from space, perhaps, the northern hemisphere in particular would have looked paler, broader at its shorelines, quieter at its rivers' mouths. The sea had retreated, respectfully, offering up land it usually keeps. To the west, across what is now North America, a continental giant settled in. The Laurentide ice sheet, like a continent upon a continent, draped itself from the high Arctic down across what would one day be Canada and into the northern United States. Its edges did not draw a straight line. They curled, scalloped, paused. Lobes reached into the basins that are now the Great Lakes, scooping and over-deepening them. Then, as climates eased, letting meltwater fill those bowls, threading them into inland seas that still breathe mist each autumn. To the northwest, along mountains and coasts, another partner shared the work, the Cordilleran ice sheet, less unified, more complex, hugging the ranges like a glacier-made braid. Where these two bodies approached one another, valleys became gates and sometimes dams. Meltwater pooled into vast proglacial lakes, held back by ice walls that seemed eternal until they weren't. Now and then, when pressure and warmth conspired, a gate could fail. In a day or a week, a quiet lake might become a roaring river, carving out coulees and scablands with a violence hard to imagine in the modern landscape. Today those tracts appear strangely clean-swept, boulder-strewn, cataract-scarred, evidence of pulses that may have echoed for centuries in the memory of those who wandered there later. Cross the Atlantic in your mind, and the glass grows again. The Fennoscandian ice sheet lay across Scandinavia and much of northern Europe, pressing down the crust so thoroughly that when it finally withdrew, the land began to rise like a slow inhale, an isostatic rebound that continues even now in some places, lifting shorelines, shifting harbours, revealing that the map is never quite finished. Another lobe touched the British-Irish Isles, scraping and smoothing, leaving crescents of stone where the ice paused, moraines like commas. South of the equator, look to the Andes, where a spine of alpine glaciers combed the mountains, while farther south a Patagonian icefield sprawled under winds that can sand the skin with ice crystals. On the other side of the world, the southern Alps of Aduayatara, New Zealand, wore their own icy crowns, and anchoring the planet's chill, Antarctica remained, continent-wide, a reservoir of cold so immense that it could be felt in the chemistry of distant raindrops. All this ice had weight, and weight has consequences. The crust flexed under its burden. River valleys were deepened, diverted, sometimes dammed. Basins subsided, then, when freed from ice, began their slow, elastic rise. In some places the sea intruded into over-deepened troughs, making fjords, salt fingers reaching back into mountains where glaciers once slid. In others, the sea retreated in deference, leaving broad continental shelves exposed to wind. Those shelves now drowned were, then, landscapes. Think of the North Sea as a meadowed plain. Think of Beringia in the far north as not a narrow bridge but a wide cold country with rivers and hills and shrubs, with caribou and steppe bison and foxes trotting their paths as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To them, it hadn't. Land is land when you can walk it. Sea level, in this long cold crest, seems to have sat lower by 100 meters or more compared to modern coastlines, depending on when and where. Numbers can flicker a bit in the literature, but the feeling is clear: the ocean had given up some of its freedom to the continents, making room for migrations for ecologies that could not exist before or after. Australia and New Guinea were joined into Sahul. Southeast Asia offered Sunda, a larger, greener stage. Tides still moved, storms still raked the shore, but the edges of the world were elsewhere. If you wander this imagined map with your fingertips, the textures change. Under the Laurentide's old footprint, the ground is often strewn with glacial till, a democratic jumble of sizes from pebbles to erratics the size of houses. Ridges of this material shaped at the margins speak of pauses. Long, sinuous mounds, eskers trace the paths of rivers that once ran within the ice itself, tunnels of water that braided and rebraided as the season shifted. Elsewhere, the ice's bed was wet and slid. Elsewhere, it was frozen to bedrock, scouring and polishing. In places where meltwater slowed, it laid down varves, paper-thin layers of silt and clay, light dark, like tree rings written by a lake. Where winds cut across the ice fronts and across exposed shelves and floodplains, they gathered dust, rock flour ground fine as soft as talcum, and laid it down in drifts that could cover a hillside with a warm, pale blanket. Loess is the name often given to these deposits. Fragile when dry, cohesive when damp, easily carved by small streams, it can yield landscapes of quiet drama, knife-edge ridges, steep little gullies, fields that in the right season glow like straw. Plants find purchase, soils build, people, much later, will carve homes into its embrace. Of course, ice did not rule everywhere. Around the equator, humidity and monsoon rhythms shifted. Some tropical regions may have been drier, forests retreating to refuges and then swelling forward again when climate allowed. Elsewhere, grasslands pushed out. The Amazon's great river still flowed, but its floodplains breathed differently. Africa's eastern corridors, where hominins had already learned to read the land, likely offered mosaics of woodland and savanna that shuffled with each climate swing. Lakes rose, fell, and sometimes broke their bounds, leaving strand lines far above modern shores that today look like the work of ancient hands. Mapping the ice also means mapping the animals who traced its margins. The Mammoth Steppe, a phrase that comes up often, was not a single blanket of habitat, but a broad, cold savanna tendency that arced around the northern world. Grasses and forbs, short summers, long winters, winds that kept snow thin, letting grazers reach food they needed. Here moved mammoths and woolly rhinos, steppe bison and horses, musk oxen, saiga antelope, and in their wake the hunters who learned both patience and celebration. Farther south, where forests found refuge, beavers of unusual size shaped waterways, and cats with curved sabers haunted the edge of shadow. To the west in the Americas, giant ground sloths are thought to have browsed with languid dignity, pulling down branches with arms like tree limbs. Each of these biographies is a map in motion. But our planet under glass was not static. The edges breathed. Summer warmth sometimes gathered strength, and the line crept back. Winters recovered, and it descended again. Storm tracks shifted. Ocean currents looped differently around capes and through straits as sea level rose and fell, perhaps modulating heat delivery to high latitudes. A delicate choreography, ice and wind and water and stone, played out over human lifetimes and beyond them. People would have noticed local versions of these motions, a valley opening, a pass clearing earlier, a river cutting a new channel. Grandchildren might hear the story of a glacier that once touched a certain ridge, and now the elders would say, sleeps farther up. If you stood on a modern beach and watched the tide go out, you might see wet sand glisten, small channels form and fade, shallow pools trapping minnows. Scale that by 1,000, by 10,000, and you have a hint of what shorelines did during these ages. New islands appeared, linked, separated, estuaries carved into valleys that had been dry plains a few centuries before. The creatures who relied on narrow coastal corridors, shellfish, seabirds, early fishers, would have followed the tide line like a moving script. There is a tenderness in these maps despite their coldness, because they remind us that the world we know is just one version. Cities that feel immovable are set upon ground written by ice. Ports we call natural owe their depth to glacial scouring and post-ice rebound. The soils that feed us in many temperate zones, rich, stone-dotted, slightly sweet when turned in spring, are gifts of a bulldozer made of snow. And when the glass lifted, it did not simply vanish. It retreated with a long memory. Lakes remained where ice had sat heavy. Kettles pocked the land where stranded blocks melted, leaving ponds that wink like mirrors through summer. Ridges and channels kept guiding wind and water. Even culture took cues. The routes of roads following old eskers, villages nesting on moraine crests, stories of spirits who live in boulders that no human could carry. As our map rolls up for now, keep one more image. The sky, full of fine particles when winds scoured exposed shelves, might have dimmed the sun a touch, painting sunsets with an extra wash of copper. Snow squeaked underfoot on the coldest mornings. Ravens rode the gust along the edge of the ice, black stitches on a white hem. And far away, where the ocean breathed, currents were planning their own stories, ones we'll meet soon in the rhythms of air and sea. When we try to hear the heartbeat of an ice age, we might press an ear not to the ground, but to the sky and the sea. Up there, the light is rationed by celestial habits, tilt, wobble, the long ellipse of our orbit. Down here, the oceans carry that light's warmth like couriers, looping it along coasts and into the deep. Between them, wind writes the weather, and clouds decide how much of the sun we're allowed to keep. If you picture the planet as a slow dancer, the steps are threefold. 1. The tilt of Earth's axis, which leans us toward and away from the sun with a grace that over tens of thousands of years subtly widens and narrows. More lean, stronger seasons, less lean, softer contrast. 2. The wobble, or precession, a top spinning, the axis sketching a small circle in the sky, changing which hemisphere points sunward during closest approach. 3. The shape of our orbit itself, nearly round at times, a little more oval at others, quietly altering how much solar attention we receive and when. No single step commands the floor, but together they set a rhythm for ice to breathe by. High-latitude summers that receive less sunlight tend to leave winter's work intact. Snow lingers, brightens the surface, reflects more light away, cools the air, invites yet more snow, an invitation that ice is very good at accepting. And when the celestial metronome ticks back, when summers grow slightly stronger, the edge softens, releases, retreats. Not immediately, not everywhere, but with that patient geological certainty we often mistake for stillness. Now lower your ear to the water. The oceans are not a single bowl, but a set of moving layered bookshelves, warm on top, cooler beneath, saltier patches here, fresher tongues there. Wind pushes the surface into gyres that spiral lazily, and the planet's rotation twists those flows. In the Atlantic, a stream often described as a conveyor helps ferry heat northward. The water cools, grows denser, and encouraged by salt, slips downward to begin a long shadowed journey back south. During glacial times, this circulation seems to have shifted tone and tempo. Perhaps sea ice spread farther, capping and quieting the exchange with the air. Perhaps fresh pulses from melting ice diluted the northern seas, making it harder for waters to sink. The details are still a quilt of hypotheses, but the feeling is consistent. Oceans were different, and because of that difference the air held itself differently too. Dust plays a quieter role, soft everywhere, perhaps more important than its humility suggests. When great areas of the continents lay bare under wind shelves exposed by lower seas, floodplains dried after meltwater rushed through, fine particles lifted and travelled. They dimmed distant skies a touch. They darkened snow where they fell, nibbling at albedo and helping the spring sun chew back winter's grip, and carried out over the oceans. Some of those grains offered trace nutrients, iron among them, fertilizing plankton, which in turn may have drawn down a little more carbon from the air. A breath here, a breath there, the planet exhaling a fraction differently. Carbon, methane and their kin whisper their own lullabies through time, trapped in bubbles inside ice cores. They tell us that the air's composition ebbed and flowed with the cold, lower greenhouse gas levels during glacial peaks, higher during interglacials. Cause and effect coil together like sleeping cats. Cooler oceans can hold more CO2. As ice spreads and climates dry in some regions, vegetation patterns shift, changing how much carbon land stores. Volcanic breaths come and go. The net result, it seems, is a self-reinforcing suite of changes. Skies that hold less heat, oceans that move warmth differently, continents bright with snow, each leaning into the other's shoulder. Storm tracks migrated. The westerlies, those mid-latitude winds, may have shifted a little poleward or equatorward, as the temperature gradient between equator and pole waxed and waned. Monsoons in the tropics likely pulsed with the seasons of sunlight, and with the heartbeat of the oceans, stronger when land heated quickly relative to sea, gentler when that contrast softened. In Africa and Asia, lakes deepened and withdrew, deserts wandered, woodlands made and unmade their borders. In the high north, when sea ice spread across waters that now stay open, wind found a different purchase. The air near the surface grew drier and colder, a subtle armour against moisture that might have fallen as nourishing snow farther inland. Clouds, the most elusive archivists, complicated everything in the best and hardest ways. A blanket on a cold night, a parasol on a hot afternoon, they cool and warm depending on their height, thickness, and when they arrive. During glacial times their patterns likely changed with aerosols and with ice cover, with vegetation and with the tracks of storms. We can sketch tendencies, but we keep our pencils soft. The sky's handwriting is notoriously hard to copy. Sea ice deserves its own small hymn. Unlike glaciers and ice sheets, it floats, and because it floats, it insulates the ocean from the air, and it brightens the surface without weighing on the crust. Forming in autumn, thickening through winter, fracturing into jigsaw plates called flows, it moves under wind and tide, making sounds like distant thunder when pressure ridges rise, like a choir of tiny bells when shards rattle along a shore. Its extent during glacial peaks might have been broad, spreading like white wings over the Arctic Ocean, and pressing southward in the North Atlantic and North Pacific. Every extra week it lingered meant more sunlight reflected, a cooler surface, a stronger loop of winter. Every early melt meant a darker sea, more heat stored for the next season. On land, permafrost knit its own patterns, ground that stays frozen year-round. Save for a skin that thaws each summer, leans trees into drunken angles, lifts polygonal cracks into honeycombs, and builds icy hills called pingos that rise slowly, and just as slowly slump. The existence of such soils alters how water moves, how plants root, how animals browse, and as it thaws or advances, those communities migrate with it. Minute adjustments accumulating until, from afar, the whole biome seems to shift. Even the cryosphere's voice can change mid-sentence. Valley glaciers sometimes speed up, thinning and stretching, then slow to a near halt. Ice sheets can surge, carving armadas of bergs that cool seas and freshen their surface. On occasion, winds that circle Antarctica strengthen or relax, trapping cold near the continent or letting it leak outward. These are all shadings, lines added to the drawing, erased, redrawn, over centuries and millennia. To those who lived then, they might have arrived as a few colder summers in a row, a river that froze a little earlier, a migration that came late. When all of these motions are layered, the picture that emerges is less a machine and more an orchestra. No single instrument explains the music. Tilt might open the movement, oceans keep the tempo, winds and clouds add the melody, dust and greenhouse gases provide harmony and counterpoint. There are crescendos, moments when several forces line up to push cold further than usual, and decrescendos, when they cannot sustain the note. Listening closely, we'll hear themes that will return later, sudden modulations that plunge us into chill in a decade or two, then climb back toward warmth just as quickly. For now, let the motif linger. The sea and sky have set the stage. Walk outside, just in imagination, and feel the north wind bite. Notice how it tastes dry, as if it has travelled far over snow. The sun is low even at noon. Nearby a river steams, not because it is hot, but because the air above it is colder still. Somewhere past the horizon, beyond hills blued by distance, the ocean has rounded a cape and arrived at a latitude where it will give up its heat and sink. A gull rides the air, deciding. Far aloft, ice crystals shimmer in a halo around the sun. Everything is saying, not forever, but for now, this is a cold world. Ice moves like a patient animal, and the land remembers its passing. Beneath the white, pressure grows. Crystals deform, melt at their bases, refreeze, and the whole body slides, sometimes inches each day, sometimes feet. Where it meets bedrock, the glacier speaks two languages at once, abrasion and plucking. One sands the surface with grit, ground from upstream, scratching long parallel striations that point like arrows. The other wrenches blocks from the lee side of obstacles, leaving steps and scars, a broken music in the stone. Follow that duet into a valley, and the shape tells you who led the dance. Rivers carve thus, narrow, steep, the lines meeting at a point where water has cut. Glaciers favour U's, broad-bottomed, generous in the middle, sheer on the sides. The ice's thickness presses outward as well as down, shaving the valley walls, over-deepening the floor. When the ice retreats, lakes often gather in those rock basins, linked by streams like a string of silver coins. Many beloved mountain valleys bear this signature. Meadows where a glacier once rested, lakes where it paused, cliffs where it gnawed and then let go. Climb higher, and you arrive at the glacier's cradle, a cirque bowl-shaped, shaded, often holding a tarn so clear it looks like a fallen piece of sky. The headwall above it can be sharp, the work of freeze-thaw shattering. Water slips into cracks, expands as it freezes, and the wall gives a little more each winter. Between neighbouring cirques, knives of rock remain, arêtes, ridges you can walk with the sense that the world drops away on both sides. Where several cirques bite at a mountain from different angles, a horn is left pyramidal, stark, a geometry lesson sketched by cold. Beyond the valley mouths, glaciers did not stop at the line we now call the mountains. In many places they poured onto lowlands and spread, still creeping, still shouldering their load. At their snouts they bulldozed what they carried, boulders and sand, pebbles and clay, into ridges that trace where the ice once paused. These are moraines, and they come in families, terminal moraines at the furthest advance, recessional moraines marking hesitations during retreat, lateral moraines along the sides. Walk one today and you might find a church set on its crest, a town built along its spine, a vineyard using its well-drained soils to hold heat close at night. Underneath the ice, rivers flowed in tunnels of meltwater, sinuous and changeable. When a glacier left, those subglacial channels set their cargo down as long, winding ridges, eskers that snake across the countryside, with a strangely deliberate purpose, perfect foundations for paths and roads. Elsewhere, as water poured away from the snout, it spread gravels into broad aprons, outwash plains that shimmer with heat in summer and sing faintly under winter's crust. Sometimes the ice left ghosts more delicate, blocks detached from the main body and lay buried in sediment, then melted without witnesses, dropping the roof into bowls, kettles that filled with water and lilies and frogs. In lakes born at the glacier's edge, fine silt and clay settled into varves, pairs of layers, light and dark, each pair likely a year, a diary kept with the patience of trees. Far out at sea, icebergs carried stones to places no river could have reached. When they melted, those rocks fell onto the seabed, drop stones that tell of sailors made of ice. Look closer at the polished bedrock left by retreating ice, and you may find asymmetric humps, roches moutonnées, with a gentle, smoothed upstream face and a rough, plucked downstream face. These are the fingerprints of flow direction, the difference between abrasion's caress and plucking's tug. Nearby, striations can cross at different angles, a palimpsest of ice that changed its mind over centuries, switching lanes as thickness and pressure and basal water rebalanced. Not all cold work is done by moving ice. Periglacial landscapes, cold but not necessarily glaciated, write their own stories. Tundra soils sort themselves into polygons and stripes as freeze-thaw. Sorting brings larger stones upward and fines downward. Solifluction lobes, tongues of soil that creep downhill when the surface thaws, but the base stays frozen, leave slow-motion waves on slopes. In some riverbanks, wedges of ground ice grow, and when they melt, they leave V-shaped troughs, ice wedge casts, like signatures of winter's insistence. The wind, too, is a mason in these zones, piling loess into blankets so thick that people later carve homes into them, courtyards sunk into pale earth that holds a coolness meaningfully kind in summer. Fjords, those long sea inlets with mountains for walls, remember glaciers most grandly. where a valley glacier reached the coast and slid into salt water. Its ability to float removed some friction. It could dig deeper there than on land. When sea level rose again and flooded those over deepened troughs, the ocean extended its fingers inland, tidal and blue, speckled with foam. Today, their cliffs echo with gulls, and their waters hold the greens of plankton blooms in spring, living evidence of cold work and warm return. The ground itself is still catching its breath. Where ice sat thickest, the crust sagged. Remove the weight, and the land rebounds slowly, elastically, like a pillow recovering after the head lifts. In Scandinavia and around Hudson Bay, you can see shorelines stepped up hillsides, old beaches now high and dry, a staircase left by the sea as the land rose beneath it. Harbours shift, marshes tilt, rivers adjust their courses to the new gradient. It is humbling to realize that a continent is not a table but a raft, flexing as loads come and go. Erratics, boulders of one rock type dropped onto bedrock of another, give us some of the friendliest evidence. You're walking through a field of limestone, and there, like a sleeping whale, lies a great hunk of granite that could only have arrived by ice. An early shepherd might have told a story about giants. A later geologist offers a different giant, the glacier, and both tales honour the strangeness of transport without wheels. All of this sculpting did more than make pretty postcards. It set the stage for soils. The tills left by ice can be fertile if mixed and aged. The loess is famously generous to roots. Outwash gravels drain quickly and keep vines from wet feet. Rivers redirected by moraine dams created wetlands that now host birds by the tens of thousands. Lakes formed in kettles and overdeepened basins became engines for local weather. Lake effect snow that feathers towns in winter, breezes that turn orchards sweet. Human histories, though young, have already braided themselves around these gifts. Rail lines along eskers, cities near outwash fans, farms on loess plains, myths wherever a lonely erratic invites a question. Listen, a different quiet now. Step into a glacial valley on a windless day and clap once. The sound returns to you clean, as if the air has been combed. In spring, meltwater strums the rocks. In autumn, larches turn whole hillsides gold above a tarn so still that clouds seem to hesitate before landing. Such places teach time differently. They are calendars in stone, yes, but they're also shelters for sensation, places where the scale of change slows your breathing until you notice your own pulse again. And yet, for all this permanence, the story holds motion at its core. Ice advances, shapes, retreats, water floods, pauses, etches, wind rearranges, plants come to hold the soil, animals seed it deeper with their passing. Nothing is finished. The Great Lakes you know today were once larger, once smaller, once connected differently. A vast proglacial lake to the northwest, fed by the melt of an ice sheet that was taking its time letting go, sent outbursts that may have redrawn river systems and nudged climate more abruptly than the slow arc would suggest. We'll visit those sudden turns soon when we meet rapid chills and meltwater floods. For now, we stand in the gallery and let the sculptures speak. Run your fingertips along a stratiation, and you're touching direction. Sit on a moraine at dusk, and you're seated on a boundary line between then and after. Hold a handful of loess and watch it puff from your palm like smoke, and you're holding the breath of a world that was, at once larger and smaller, seas drawn down, continents enlarged, the horizon pushed outward. Stone remembers, but so do we. The words we use for landforms, cirque, arete, esker, pingo, are small spells that let us point and say, something once lived here that is not here now, and yet its handwriting remains. To learn these is not to pass a test, it is to widen attention, to walk through a world that has carried and carved us, and to feel perhaps a little carved into belonging, too. When people whisper Ice Age, the mind often fills with white. But the world that fed the giants was not blank, it was textured, windswept and breathing, a tapestry of grasses and herbs and low shrubs stitched across a continent-spanning reach. Scientists sometimes call it the Mammoth Steppe, a phrase that almost sounds like a dance. It stretched on and off from the shores of Iberia, across the belly of Eurasia, through Beringia's wide country, and into the high plains of the Americas, a ribbon of light and shadow under a long cool sky. Think of it as a cold savanna tendency rather than a uniform field. In places the snow blew thin, combed by steady winds, so that animals could reach forage even in midwinter. In others, river bottoms held willow and birch thickets, green tunnels in summer that flickered gold and silver in autumn. Between them, ridges wore a fuzz of sedges and flowering forbs, plant names that don't often make it into bedtime stories, and yet here they were, the syllables of survival. The ground, often dry and firm, kept hooves from sinking. The air held fewer insects than a hot wetland would have, and the light, low in winter, stretched shadows into ribbons long enough to be their own kind of navigation. Across this engine of calories moved bodies built for distance and cold. Mammoths, shaggy, tusked, cautious elders, teaching calves the memory of roots. Woolly rhinoceroses, with their sloped backs and thick coats, brushing snow aside with a push of keratin horn. Steppe bison, heavier at the shoulders, drifting in herds that could change a valley's sound with the rhythm of their chewing. Horses with compact frames and dark manes that lifted when the wind turned. Musk oxen, though not truly oxen, forming a circle when wolves coursed in from the ridgeline. Calves tucked into the living palisade. Saiga antelope, with improbable noses that warmed the air they breathed, racing over frozen ground as if the cold had given them wings. Behind and among them, predators read the same lines in the grass. Dire wolves, larger cousins of familiar canids, paced the horizon with a stamina that might have seemed inexhaustible. Cave lions, perhaps maneless, perhaps not, haunted river corridors and kept their distance from human fires in a way that suggests mutual respect. Saber-toothed cats, powerful and precise, preferred ambush to marathon, melting into shadow and then becoming all momentum. In the far north, foxes printed constellations into fresh snow each night, their tracks a soft Morse code of hunger and luck. If we press an ear to that wind, we might hear a different music, the tiny clicks and scrapes of a billion mouths not visible at a distance. Voles and lemmings tunneled under the snow, living within the subnivean world, warm by comparison, feeding on plant stems and bark. Their numbers rose and fell like tides, and snowy owls rode those tides, white sails appearing in winter where they were most needed. Dung beetles, too, did their patient work when the season allowed, returning what was eaten to the soil. This was not a barren land, it was a brisk metabolism. The Mammoth Steppe may have been surprisingly productive for a cold place. Dryness kept nutrients cycling on the ground rather than locked within deep, wet peat. Hooves stirred seeds into scuffed soil, grazing cropped back tall stems and made room for new growth, encouraging a meadow's patchwork of species instead of a monoculture. In summer, flowers caught in the wind's comb fed bees and hoverflies, which in turn fed birds that stitched quick shadows across the grass. In spring, rivers flexed with snowmelt and flooded their banks just enough to lay a new line of silt, brown and generous. And in autumn, the seed heads rattled like soft rain over fur and feather. We picture mammoths in snowstorms because that is where contrast lives. But perhaps more often we might imagine an overcast summer afternoon, the air cool, the horizon very far. A matriarch stands, testing the wind with a trunk that has known 100 grasses and the smell of 1,000 waters. Calves practice entwining their small trunks, then hurry to cross the shallow braid of a river. On the far bank, a bison turns its head, black eye catching a reflection you can't quite see. Farther off, a group of horses stand in a line so that the wind hits their faces. They drift sideways, a shared mind shifting one step at a time. Above, a lark lifts and sings as if the sky itself is a bowl it knows by heart. Not all the giants grazed. In the forests at the margins, giant ground sloths, some species in the Americas, grew as large as a small truck, may have pulled down branches and peeled bark with claws shaped like scythes. Their movement would have had the unhurried dignity of an animal that trusts its mass. Along lakes and rivers in North America, beavers as big as bears, it seems, swam with heads like polished logs, teeth capable of reshaping a bank in an evening's work. In South America, armored relatives called glyptodonts, imagine a car-sized armadillo with a domed shell, may have rumbled through scrub, their tails sometimes tipped with spiky clubs. In Eurasia, moose dipped muzzles into cold ponds. In the far west, camels and horses native to the Americas, long before later reintroductions, shared grass with pronghorns, whose speed still speaks of a vanished predator. The calendar on this steppe was simple and exacting. Light increased, then waned. Somewhere between those halves were migrations that took more than a day and less than a year. In spring, pregnant cows sought rich patches. In early summer, insects, few but enough, pestered flanks and encouraged animals toward windier ground. In late summer, foals' legs learned confidence, practiced by doing. In autumn, fat layered beneath hide and hair. In winter, muscles were currency spent in careful increments, and knowledge where the snow blew thin, where willow tips remained, was heirloom wealth. Predator and prey practiced a curriculum older than bones. A wolf pack, moving with that low, rain-slick gait, tested herds for hesitation, for the faint irregularity that meant an injury not obvious to the eye. The herd read them back, turned as a school of fish turns, and resumed. A cat waited. A fox measured risk by ear, deciding whether the rustle below the snow was large enough to fight back or small enough to become warmth in a narrow belly. The steppe made these decisions common, and therefore almost gentle. Even death, which came as it must, arrived most often without spectacle, quick, necessary, and at once swallowed by the cold air. How to imagine their sound? Not silence. Never silence. The wind braided with the low conversation of grazers, the clack of horn against horn when sparring turned ceremonial, the bubble talk of a river trying on its spring voice. In winter, hooves on crusted snow can be as sharp as cracking glass. In summer, the dry rattle of seed pods might be all you hear for minutes at a time until the herd shifts and starts again. The Mammoth Steppe was not immune to change, its borders breathed with climate pressing farther south in colder pulses, curling back in warmth. Where shrubs gained courage, they seeded shade and altered the snow's behavior, holding drifts that lingered into spring. Trees probed riverlines, throwing long roots into banks that would later resist floods differently. In some centuries, dusty skies fertilized far seas. In others, calmer winds let plants stand taller and drop seed locally. Herbivores responded, sometimes thriving, sometimes thinning, until a new balance arrived. One winter later, then two. Humans appear in this landscape first as watchers, then as participants, and finally perhaps as choreographers who never fully control the dance they have joined. We'll meet them properly in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to say that their fires, small at first, sometimes green smoky in the damp, carved out circles of scent that animals learned to either avoid or investigate. A mammoth could learn that a particular valley held a risk. It could navigate by timing, arrive before the river swells, cross before humans wake. A herd could learn that a rock promontory with a good view was also a trap when the wind played tricks. These were not battles so much as negotiations, and the contracts were written in footprints and wind direction. There were oddities, because every broad truth shelters surprises. Irish elk, whose antlers spread wider than a doorway, stepped heavily through frost-silvered grass, their silhouettes like moving thickets. Short-faced bears with long limbs and an oversized presence may have patrolled open country with a stride that carried them like a shadow across miles. In the south, terror birds of earlier times had mostly ceded the stage, but in the Americas, great condors and perhaps even larger kin could ride thermals above carrion, arriving like solemn judges to close a page and start another. In caves, hyenas, where they held territory, laughed their broken music into the dark. And then there were the small acts that hold a world together. A vole, scooting under snow, nicks the root of a grass just so and makes it branch in spring. A muskox calf, having survived its first winter within the living ring of adults, learns the way a circle forms not through instruction but through the instant you must be where you are needed. A mammoth matriarch pauses in a river and raises her trunk, sensing not danger but memory, the faint odor of a plant her mother led her to decades ago, growing along a bank that has shifted but not entirely forgotten its older shape. If we are looking for a single sentence to carry away, perhaps it is this: the Mammoth Steppe was ordinary for its time. That is not to diminish its wonder. It is to remind us that ordinary can mean abundant, stable enough to teach and flexible enough to absorb droughts and storms. It was not a museum diorama. It was home to feathers and fur, to hooves and paws, to claws and careful eyes, to a way of moving and eating and avoiding being eaten that held for thousands of years, until a set of overlapping changes, climate swings, sharpening, people multiplying and learning faster, ecosystems crossing thresholds, tipped it toward other forms. Even now, in a few places where climate and land use allow, slivers of that world seem to echo. The air tastes similar on certain high plains in late October. The wind combs grass into the same chords. The feeling that distance is not emptiness but invitation, that too remains. If you stand there and close your eyes, you might not picture a single animal. You might just feel a pressure ease between your shoulders as the space makes room for your breath. Let the herd drift across the ridge in your mind and vanish without hurry. The last footfalls soften into the wind's thread. Ahead, in the dark bright of the next fire, people will be speaking in low voices over bone and ember, sowing and planning, telling stories in which the grass has opinions and the rivers keep secrets. We'll sit with them a while. Night gathers early under a glacial sky. By mid-afternoon in winter, the light is already thinking of leaving, and you make your choices with that in mind. Gather fuel, check the meat cache, find the right angle of shelter against the wind. A small fire crackles, not large, not wasteful, feeding on willow twigs and bone fat, on driftwood smoothed to a softness that fits the hand. The smoke smells clean, a ribbon of grey that vanishes into the cold as if the air were hungry for warmth. This is a human camp at the edge of the Mammoth Steppe. It could be in a river bend where willows lean. It could be in the wind shadow of a low hill. It could be in an open field under a sky full of low constellations. The shelter is simple and exacting. Hide walls stretched over ribs, sometimes literally ribs from mammoths, in regions where bone was plentiful and wood scarce. A ring of stones holds the hearth. A shallow pit nearby is lined with ice and snow to make a cold well before such things had names. At the entrance, a line of tracks tells you who came and went since the last snowfall. Inside, a lamp flickers, tallow and moss or rendered fat feeding a flame that does not smoke much when you adjust the wick with a pin of bone. People here wear their skill. Tailored clothing, sewn with sinew thread and bone or ivory needles, hugs the wrists and ankles where heat otherwise leaves in a hurry. Parkas layered with fur turn the wind's bite into a suggestion. Leggings lined with soft skin avoid chafe on long days. Boots, mucklocks in some traditions, the word much later, are a genius of layers. Dried grass or fur as insulation, hide for strength, a sole that flexes just enough over snow and ice. Hoods frame faces that have learned how to keep breath from freezing lashes shut. Gloves, mittens, fingerless work wraps for fine tasks. Each choice weighs warmth against dexterity. Each choice is a knowledge passed between hands. Tools rest near the fire, waiting for the next good day. A spear thrower, and a tlatl, leans by the doorway, a simple lever that can turn a good arm into a great one, hurling a dart fast and far enough to surprise even a wary animal. Thrusting spears for close work stand stacked by the wall. Their hafts are burnished from use, dark where hands have gripped, blades struck from long stone cores, thin, efficient slide into slots on bone handles, becoming knives that can separate hide from muscle with minimal waste. Scrapers smooth skins, awls open holes as neatly as a modern punch. In some seasons, barbed points hint at fish runs to come. A coil of twisted plant fibre, cordage made from nettle perhaps, waits for a sled, a travois, a load that must be tied just so. Food is both daily and seasonal math. In late summer and autumn, the camp dried meat on racks, thin strips smoked gently so they would not spoil. In winter, caches dug into frozen ground keep fat cool and safe from scavengers, marked by a pattern of stones only your family will recognize once it snows. Marrow becomes broth. Bone grease turns roots into comfort, when roots can be found. Where coastlines lay farther out than today, some groups likely walked the edge of tide and took shellfish, fish and seals, the sea offering its own curriculum of tides and patience. Inland, fish trapped beneath river ice are coaxed to a hole with light and careful timing. In spring, runs turn silver water into plenty. Hunting is less a jewel than a choreography. Before dawn, scouts climb a rise to read the wind. People speak softly, or not at all, and the weather carries those words away. A drive might be planned using a notch between low hills, using snow crust that will hold a human but not a heavy animal, using brush wands planted to suggest a fence where none exists. Nothing is certain. Everything is rehearsed by memory. A good day brings enough, never more than can be respected. Meat carried back on sleds or shoulders, hide folded and tied, sinew set aside for thread, bones sorted for tool and for fuel. Waste is a word for people who don't plan to see the next winter. Children learn this by playing at the edge of the firelight. They set lines of small stones for pretend traps. They practice throws with miniature spears onto rings drawn in snow. They listen, drowsy, to the rhythm of stories in which animals have opinions, weather has moods, and rivers remember kindnesses. The line between instruction and myth is not really a line, it is a braid. In one strand you learn that a willow bark tea eases the ache after a hard day. In another, you learn that certain places are to be greeted like elders. In a third, you learn a song that times your stroke when scraping a hide, because the beat is the right speed and because it makes the work closer to joy. Art, in this world, is not a luxury, it is the shape of attention. A strip of ivory is carved into a small figure, stylized perhaps, or tenderly detailed, fingers smoothing a curve into shine. A cave wall lit by flickering lamps offers up bison and horses, hands stenciled by breath blown over pigment, dots and lines that suggest movement when the flame wavers. A flute made from the hollow wing bone of a large bird carries a melody that might be older than any one language. Necklaces of shell or tooth clink softly when someone turns their head. These are not decorations on the body, they are the body remembering itself beyond hunger and cold. Trade spreads warmth over distance. A blade of obsidian in a camp far from the nearest volcano suggests networks, families visiting families, gifts travelling from hand to hand, the news of a birth or a death arriving with a tool that is razor thin and night black. Seashells show up inland. Pigments rare in one valley are common in another and move between them like favour. Dogs appear in some of these stories. Companions, guards, hunting partners. Exactly when and where their partnership with us began is still debated, but it seems to have flourished in cold places as well as warm ones. Their tracks interlace with ours at the camp's edge, tails writing short, bright punctuation into the snow. Danger is a fact, and yet the mood is not bleak. A sudden storm can make a simple walk a trial. Thin ice has its own treachery. Predators test boundaries. Wolves that learn which camps will throw sparks and which will lower their voices and watch. Illness is harder to name, but easy to recognize. and remedies, bark, steam, rest, certain fats are remembered with a care as serious as any hunt. And yet the laughter you hear at night when the wind drops is not forced. It is the relief of belonging to a circle around which the dark is held at arm's length. The calendar of a human year in the cold is as ritualized as any migration. Late winter, the hardest weeks when stores are carefully measured and days lengthen, but the snow's grip seems somehow stronger for a while. Early spring, when river ice sighs apart and the first green shows, a taste so sharp after months of meat that it stings the tongue. Summer, a brief abundance, a bustle, hides tanned when warmth helps, fish dried in breezes, trips made to distant families along paths that only appear safely when rivers run low. Autumn, a slow tightening, fortifying fat, gratitude made practical. Thank the animals in words and in care with the parts you return to the land. Not all people lived the same way in the same winter. Along coasts, houses could be framed with driftwood and whalebone, thick with sod against the wind, warmer than their materials would suggest. Farther inland, hide tents moved with herds, their poles remembering the shape of the sky. In the European heartland of Glacier's reach, open-air camps near lowest bluffs offered both shelter from the wind and sightlines that gave time to prepare. In high mountains, summer pastures and stone-walled niches gave way to lower winter sites where sun lingered longer. Everywhere the same human principles held: reduce exposure, increase redundancy, share risk, store knowledge where a single accident cannot erase it. Language perhaps swelled to meet the requirement of remembering. Words for snow in different tempers: grainy, squeaking, bearing, new, sticky, treacherous, soft, insulating, safe to sleep upon. Words for wind: sharp, from the east, carrying the smell of thaw from the south, empty from the north, full of promises best ignored. Words for water: black ice, rotten ice, young ice, running shallow, running bankful, running with fish. And then the words for kin and obligation, for gratitude and apology, for the ways to say we saw you, we tried, we failed, we will do better. A winter harsh enough to thin what is not essential can also refine what is. In such places, speech becomes a warm tool. If there is a single invention that carries through all these camps, it might be the needle, a tiny marvel of concentration, to push a thread through hide without tearing it, to stitch folds so that wind cannot find a purchase. This is engineering worn against the skin. Fire is older, perhaps, but clothes make fire portable. You carry a hearth small around your body, a margin against frost and chance. And if there is a single virtue that reads through all these winters, it might be attention. Attention to how hoarfrost grows on grass stems and tells you where cold pooled last night. Attention to ravens, whose interest in a distant ridge can save you hours by pointing to a carcass. A chance for meat, fat, sinew. Attention to the way ice sings before it breaks, a sound heard in the bones more than the ears. Attention to each other, to who is tired in a way they will not name, to who remembers a song that keeps hands moving when the work is repetitive and necessary. We sometimes talk about bottlenecks in human history, moments when our species or a region's people thinned to a few lines that later blossomed again. These are reconstructions, careful and provisional, drawn from genes and stones and the stubborn memory of landscapes. Whether or not a given winter brought a true narrowing, life at the edge of the ice asked for the same response: that we lean into each other, that we spread load, that we make meaning that can be carried as easily as a story and as effectively as a tool. The fire in this camp burns lower. Someone pinches the wick of the lamp and feeds it a breath of oil. Outside, the aurora, if you are far enough north, might be writing green calligraphy across the sky, silent and intent. Inside, a baby sleeps with a hand around a finger that is work rough but careful. A dog turns twice and sighs, nose tucked under tail. A grandmother reaches for a bag of beads and begins in the lamplight to extend a pattern by 3 more shells, then 4, because enough is good and a little beauty is better. There is a temptation, in telling these stories, to make heroes and to smooth edges, but the humbler truth feels truer. The people who kept fires in the snow were not exceptional by their own measure. They were themselves. They carried forward what had been carried to them. They made mistakes and recovered or didn't and were remembered. Their genius was the same as ours when we are at our best: to notice, to adapt, to care, to teach. Tomorrow, if the wind steadies from the west, a small party will follow the river to a bend where fish sometimes hold. Someone will scrape a hide with a rhythm that could be a lullaby. Someone else will test a new point on a dart and make a face that means it will do. And at dusk, if the clouds lift, you will step out and hear distant wolves and feel, not fear so much as witness. Everything is alive. Everything is practicing. Let us leave this camp with our hands warmed and our eyes night soft. Ahead, the world's roads that weren't there, Beringia, Sunda, Sahul, wait in the low sea dawn. But for a moment, stand in the doorway and taste the air. It's cold, yes. It also smells like wood smoke and soup, like snow and clean fur and the faint resin of a branch that will catch again when you touch it to the coals. At low tide, the world grows larger. That's true on any beach. Now imagine a low tide that lasts 10,000 years, and you begin to see the roads that weren't there. Broad, pale shelves of continent exposed to wind and light, linking places we now think of as islands, turning seas into rooms with many doors. People walked those rooms. They followed animals, followed seasons, followed curiosity and the shape of the coast. They travelled not by highways but by habits, and by knowing where the horizon hid food and shelter. Beringia is often pictured as a narrow bridge, but perhaps it felt more like a country. Rivers braided across it, willows crouched in their lee, and herds stamped the snow into paths that returned each year like a familiar melody. The sea stood lower, on the order of 100 meters or so below modern shorelines, because water was locked in ice. With that drawdown, Asia and North America shook hands, not fingertip to fingertip, but palm to palm. The air there could be dry and clear, the kind of cold that squeaks underfoot, the kind of spring that arrives with a suddenness that makes birds laugh. In that space, people might have lingered for generations, hunting, mending, watching the sky before a season came, when the way south looked open enough to try. When the ice allows, land opens. When it blocks, our glance turns to water. Even at lowest seas, a few crossings were always water. The far islands between Sunda and Sahul, the shelf that once gathered Sumatra, Borneo, Java and the mainland on one side, and the continent now split as Australia and New Guinea on the other, were steps in a staircase that never quite touched. Boats must have carried people the rest of the way. Not great ships necessarily, perhaps dugouts, perhaps bundles of buoyant stalks, perhaps a raft clever enough to ride a short, favourable wind. The distances were modest but meaningful. A family would need nerve, timing, and a map made of stories, when currents turned, what clouds meant, where the birds aimed themselves at dusk. Sunda itself would have been a green expanse, river-veined, seasonally wet and then drying, monsoon-breathed. Elephants and tigers on the western shelves, orangutans moving in forests that reached across areas that waves now occupy. Farther east, something changed. A line that naturalists later called Wallace's, less a wall than a gradient, marked different animals on either side. The ocean's deep straits there kept some creatures from crossing even when the sea withdrew. People, being generalists with a taste for puzzles, found their ways all the same. North of Europe, the North Sea's floor rose into meadows. Doggerland, a wide, soft country that is now only hinted at by ancient peats raised in trawlers' nets, by flint snapped and forgotten, by antlers shaped into tools. Families might have walked from what we now call Britain into the lowlands of the continent without noticing a border. They would have watched reindeer file past in frosty dawns, heard cranes arguing high overhead in spring, and looked toward a horizon where the tide today murmurs, but then lay still grass and a river's lazy shine. Back in the far north, the when and how of the first people moving deep into the Americas remains a gentle argument among researchers and the land itself. There's a story about a corridor between great ice sheets, Laurentide to the east, Cordilleran to the west, gradually opening as climate warmed. It might have allowed passage inland with lakes and grazers and places to camp, though timing matters. A corridor can be open biologically, able to feed and water travellers, only after it is open physically. There's another story about a quieter coastal path, a kelp-lined highway of sorts, where small boats could slip from cove to cove, harvesting shellfish and fish and sea mammals, stepping ashore to mend and rest, then pushing on when fog lifted. Both might be true in different measures, at different moments for different groups. The ocean erases campsites, rivers rearrange their mouths, we are left with breadcrumbs, stone, bone, a hearth here, a tool there, and with care in our conclusions. What makes a road is not just ground but memory. Imagine a point on Beringia where a family pauses at dusk. A child asks which way the caribou went last spring. An elder answers by pointing to a notch in a far ridge, and then to a river bend that shines like a blade in late sun. That gesture joins places. Repeat it enough times and the gesture is a path. Repeat it across a few generations, and it becomes a custom, a habit, a quiet promise that if you go now, you will arrive where food is waiting and the wind is kinder. Dogs almost certainly walked these margins with us, their paws printing over our own tracks, their ears teaching us things we'd missed. Whether they joined the partnership before, during, or after certain crossings is still debated, but the sight of a dog trotting ahead of a sled or keeping a respectful distance from a cooking fire feels right on any of these roads. They would have warned of strangers and of the wrong kind of silence. They would have held back a fox on a winter night. They would have carried warmth as well as work. And what of the things we carried? Knives of stone struck thin and sharp, wrapped in leather to protect both blade and hand, needles cached in little bone tubes like treasure, pigments for marking a child's right, or for marking the inside of a shelter, with a pattern that makes the place feel like a human room. Stories, too, weighed nothing, and weighed everything. On a crossing between islands in the dawn, someone might have sung to keep the oar strokes gently timed, to keep fear from sharpening into panic if the wind shifted, to keep the gaze soft enough to notice floating wrack that meant a favourable current nearby. The shore itself was a teacher. Kelp forests, those green-brown cathedrals, harbour fish and shellfish, slow the swell, gather edible snails and crabs among their holdfasts. Following that ribbon could have meant a reliable pantry. If you knew when to leave it and when to cling, tides marked time, birds marked season. The smell of a beach after a storm could sort edible from unwise with a finesse learned by trial and passed on with humour so as not to frighten the young. Long before maps were drawn, the body knew bearings. You wake and your face tells you the wind shifted at dawn. Your clothes tell you the air is wetter than yesterday. Your feet remember the texture of a certain sandbar, and that texture tells you which river mouth you are nearing. Clouds stack in a way that means a landmass ahead, unseen. The taste of the water you boil at camp, just a trace more mineral, confirms you are far upriver for this time of year. These are not metaphors, they are navigation that leaves nothing behind but arrival. Sea level does not fall in a line. It steps down, pauses, steps down again. People likely stepped with it. A ridge that was once a peninsula becomes a hill on a plain, becomes a reef in a shallow sound. A cave with soot on its ceiling becomes a cave with frost falling from a roof, becomes a place where seals haul out and people return briefly with respect. Later, when the water rises, that cave becomes rumour, and yet the path that led there remains in story. A direction, a time of year, a taste of certain berries ripening near a spring. When the seas rose again, and they did as ice retreated, the roads vanished without fanfare. Doggerland drowned not in a day, but in lifetimes. Headlands becoming peninsulas, becoming islands, until one storm too many salt-washed a settlement that had already been half-emptied. Beringia thinned to a chain of remembered places. The Sunda shelf filled, and the old river courses wrote themselves into the floor of the South China Sea. We stand on modern shores and watch waves that hide those fields, those hearths, those flint chips, and we say it's hard to imagine living out there. It was not out there then, it was simply the yard. Perhaps the tenderest part of these roads is that they weren't marked. No milestones, no carved signs pointing left or right. They were marked by birds and rivers, by the way spring softened the ground just as a certain flower opened, by the pattern of stars at a certain hour. A mistake could be costly, but attention kept mistakes small, and when error came, it was folded into teaching. Not that way after first snow, not after 3 days of east wind, not when the seals turn their heads in that particular way and the ocean seems to hold its breath. If you listen, you can feel the echo of those crossings in your own life. Travel you did, because you wanted a different kind of light for a season. A move made because a friend said the work might suit you there. A walk taken, because the river today smelled of rain in a way that reminded you of someone. We still make maps by talking to each other. We still choose routes by balancing hunger and hope. The roads that weren't there brought people into new conversations with unfamiliar plants, with winds that had never yet held their smoke, with animals that did not recognize their smell. Sometimes the conversation blossomed, sometimes it thinned. Over time, seeds caught in a hem or on a dog's fur, tools traded down a chain of meetings, marriages across headlands stitched cultures into patterns that a cartographer would envy. Then the sea returned, and the stitching changed. That too became a story. For all their scale, these migrations might have looked ordinary from inside a life. A day's walk, then a rest. A week of fishing, then a decision. A winter where the caribou took a different branch of the river, then a spring where you tried the other branch and found another meadow, one with the same wind, a little more shade. And over generations the ordinary added up to children laughing under a different mountain. Hold that softness as we turn toward weather that refuses softness. Moments when the planet's long rhythm skipped a beat, when winter fell back like a curtain in a handful of years, when ice and ocean spoke abruptly. We'll move through those pages gently, and whenever the wind in the story rises, we'll step into a stand of trees for a breath before we go on. Most of the Ice Age turns pages slowly, but sometimes the book snaps shut, or opens to a very different chapter, in the span of a few winters. To read those turns, we listen to ice itself. Not the surface that melts and refreezes with the seasons, but deep cores lifted from Greenland and Antarctica, cylinders of layered time with bubbles of old air caught like bells. Their chemistry suggests that temperature, dust and greenhouse gases sometimes change together in steps. and that some steps were steep enough to feel in a lifetime. There's a name for the quick warming seen in Greenland's record, Dansgaard Odeshger events. They seem to have arrived dozens of times during the long chill temperatures, climbing by several degrees in mere decades, perhaps less in other regions, but enough to shift storm tracks, to redraw where snow lingered, to change the rules of a river's spring flood. Imagine a camp that had known a reliable rhythm, ice on the lake by a certain moon, melt by another, and then within a grandparent's memory, both moons wandering, herds would have tested new valleys, fish would have paused in different pools, people would have moved their caches a little, then a little more, testing where the ground kept its promises. There's another name for a different kind of drama, Heinrich events. In these armadas of icebergs appear to have swept into the North Atlantic, shed from ice shelves and glaciers that surged and fractured. As the bergs melted, stones they carried from far inland fell and sprinkled the ocean floor, making a layer a geologist can point to and say, here is a day when ice went sailing. Fresh water poured from that melt would have lightened and cooled the sea surface, perhaps muffling the Atlantic's heat conveyor, perhaps letting winter leak farther and longer into spring. If you were living downwind of such a mood, the air would have felt more severe, the shore perhaps more fickle, the ice on rivers thicker but treacherous late in the season. And then there is the Younger Dryas, a chill that arrived late, almost like a reversal. After the last great glacial maximum eased, the world began to green, forests advanced, glaciers drew back, and human groups in many places tried new ways of gathering and storing. Then, roughly at the turn between what we now call the Pleistocene and the Holocene, the North snapped cold again, for something like 1,000 and a few hundred years, depending on where you stood. This reversal seems to have come on fast, perhaps in a handful of years or a decade, quick enough that a person could tell a child, winters were gentler when I was young, and mean it. Why? We have several stories, each part plausible, none final. One suggests a sudden flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic, meltwater from lakes dammed against the retreating ice sheet, perhaps near the heart of North America, perhaps released eastward or northward, when an ice dam failed. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. Add enough and the surface resists sinking, disrupting the conveyor that usually carries heat north. Another idea looks to the sky for dust and for changing winds, shifting the balance of sunlight and cloud at high latitudes. A third points tentatively toward an extraterrestrial trigger, a comet or fragments arguing over layers of glassy spherules and burned sediments. This remains debated, carefully and rightly so. It's possible that several nudges overlapped oceans already on the edge, ice ready to respond, atmosphere primed, so that a small push produced a cascade. When the planet lurches, landscapes reorganize. In the Levant, a pattern of villages experimenting with planting and storing might have paused, shifted, or adapted, people doubling back to more mobile strategies where harvests faltered. In northern Europe, birch and pine that had been marching across the tundra may have slowed, stopped, or retreated, leaving open ground to the reindeer again. In the Americas, ice-marginal rivers might have braided and rebraided as meltwater pulses changed their load, creating and abandoning channels in the span of a generation. On the Mammoth Steppe, snow that had grown softer could crust hard again, forcing grazers to burn precious fat to pour through. Predators would have read their maps anew. People being people would have moved and tried. It's tempting to cast these shifts as disasters, and to some they were. A winter too cold for too long thins the old and the very young. A flood that comes once in a life seems like a message, but the quieter story might be of adjustment, of camps moved 20 miles downriver, of fishing weirs rebuilt in new shallows, of a decision to marry into a group that winters where the wind comes less cruelly off a certain ridge. 1,000 decisions like that make a culture resilient without anyone naming the word. If the Younger Dryas is the dramatic pause late in the cold book, there are other quick pages, like the 8.2 thousand-year event, a sharp, cool snap after the broader warming of the Holocene had begun. That one too might echo a freshwater pulse as remnant ice lakes in the high north found their way to the sea, a last hiccup in the long thaw. The pattern suggests that the ocean's circulatory system is sensitive, not delicate, exactly, but reactively sensitive, to the mix of salt and fresh, heat and wind. Think of it as a set of locks on a canal. Change the flow in one chamber abruptly, and the whole staircase pauses and adjusts. Abruptness on geological scales doesn't always mean drama to the eye. Imagine you live near a lake. For 20 years, winters freeze it to a certain thickness. You set your fish traps at a certain depth, because you know the light there will be just enough to draw them. In the 21st year, the ice takes 2 weeks longer to form, and 3 weeks longer to leave. Your traps catch different fish. You try a slightly different bait. Your neighbor moves their camp to a bay that holds cold longer. None of this is news beyond your valley, and yet, Added up across thousands of valleys, it is the world rearranging. Megafauna. The giants we've walked with felt the staccato of these swings in their own vocabularies. A sudden crusting of snow after a thaw can starve grazers who cannot break through. A shift in spring timing, plants leafing out earlier or later, can uncouple the birth of calves from the flush of food. Rivers running higher with melt can cut off traditional crossings just when a herd needs them most. Predators adapt faster, so do people. A species already close to the edge of its tolerance can find that what was once a difficult year now arrives every third year, then every other, and then too often to recover between. Pause a moment, step out of the wind. Hear the sound your coat makes when you shake off spindrift. Smell snow. Yes, it has a smell. Metallic, clean, faintly sweet when the air is very cold. In a spruce's lee, the air warms by a breath. You can take your glove off to adjust a strap without stinging. A raven clacks and tilts, mapping your route in its bright, ancient mind. Even in abrupt times, there are pockets of steadiness. Those pockets are where people rest and plan. What did planning look like when the climate could misbehave? Diversify. Don't rely on a single river. No 3. Don't eat only the fat. Render some to store. Don't marry only within your own winter circle. Braid families across corridors so a hard year here can be answered by hospitality there. Don't forget how to make the old tools when a new one seems superior. Materials travel unevenly and fashion changes with the weather. Don't shame caution. Yesterday's shortcut becomes tomorrow's trap if the ice has a different mood. Researchers read the sharpness of these swings in more than ice. In cave formations, layers grow thicker or thinner with wetness. In lake beds, different pollen arrives and tells a story of forests coming and going. In ocean sediments, the shells of tiny drifting creatures record the temperature of the water where they grew. The patterns line up closely enough across these archives that the idea of a twitchy climate is no longer surprising. It is, instead, part of what makes our home interesting. Sometimes uncomfortably so. There's a humility that follows from this. We tend to think in baselines, what our childhood taught us the weather should be like, what our grandparents insist it was like, what the last 20 years have been. The Ice Age asks us to soften those baselines, to make room for a planet that can shift gears without asking permission, and to admire the ways life rides along, bruised, sometimes but still intent. If you could stand on a ridge the year the Younger Dryas announced itself, you might have seen less than legend promises. A colder wind, yes. A day when the river, which usually went dark with thaw by a certain moon, stayed milky and cold. A year when the berries failed and everyone's mouth stained less purple for a season. And then the next year, a flood that scoured the banks and left fish stranded in pools where hands could gather them. The world giving and taking in adjacent breaths. When the cold finally loosened its grip again, forests advanced with a patience that must have felt like a blessing. Birch first, bright and quick, then taller, denser shade. Rivers pulled themselves together into more stable courses. Animals followed, people too. Some kept moving widely, some rooted a little more. The quick pages turned back to longer paragraphs, and within those the seeds of villages, new tools, different rituals, all still carrying the memory of abruptness, the wisdom of keeping baskets many and roots most. Let the wind ease now. Warm your hands over a small imagined fire. Watch sparks take the same path every spark takes. Up and gone? Ahead we'll meet the fading of the giants more directly, the layered reasons, the overlapping timelines, the caution of apportioning cause. We'll soften every hard edge with the sound of a creek, and the smell of wet earth where spring is trying on its first green. The world's great animals do not leave quietly, and yet in the end, they left. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same moment. But across late Pleistocene maps, the Americas, Eurasia, Australia, many islands later, big bodies grew fewer, and then their stories grew quiet, and then we were left with bones, with tools, with art, and with questions spoken softly. One way to begin is with a calendar laid over continents. In Australia and New Guinea, joined then as Sahul, many of the largest marsupials and reptiles seem to have dwindled by roughly 50 to 40,000 years ago, give or take. Diprotodon, a behemoth browsing marsupial, giant kangaroos with odd stiff gaits, huge lizards and giant birds. Fewer traces after that threshold. In the Americas, the thinning appears later, around 13 to 11,000 years ago for many species. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths and glyptodonts, American lions and short-faced bears, many vanish around then. In Eurasia, some iconic cold-adapted species, woolly rhinoceros, the great cave bear, fade on their own schedules as forests return and hunting pressure and climate weave together. Islands write still later chapters. Moas in Aotearoa/New Zealand, after Polynesian arrival, giant lemurs in Madagascar, each with its own cadence. We hold several explanations in gentle hands, not wishing to clutch any too tightly. Climate change, arriving in pulses and steppes, reshaped habitats. Grasslands became shrublands, then forests. Lakes rose and fell, snow crusts hardened unevenly. Spring came early here, late there. Many large animals are specialists in slow time, able to roam far to survive lean winters, but less able to pivot when the food they need shifts not by miles but by rules. Layered onto that, human presence grew, numbers small at first, knowledge deepening quickly, tools improving. A spear thrown with a lever can reach vital places with a certainty that accumulates across seasons. Fire set carefully can open a thicket and change brows for years. Dogs, where allied, could corner, distract, carry warning farther than a human voice. There's a hypothesis, blitzkrieg some have called it, that imagines a wave of swift overhunting as people entered new lands. It is one story among several. Another sketches a quieter pressure, low-level hunting, year after year, that tips the scales for species already stressed by earlier winters and shorter summers. A third points to habitat mosaics breaking apart, rivers altered by meltwater floods, shorelines leaping, plants shifting their timing, so that the journeys animals once made now require crossing gaps that did not exist before. A fourth, less supported but sometimes whispered, considers disease travelling with new companions and preying on animals with no experience of it. No single page turns for every place. In some regions, archaeology suggests humans and giants lived together for centuries. In others, tools and bones pile up in ways that hint at brisker change. Perhaps the most sobering pattern is geographical. Where large mammals had long experience with human hunters, Africa above all, parts of southern Asia as well, many giants persisted into the Holocene and in some places endure today. Co-evolution, it seems, may have taught both sides caution. Elsewhere, where people arrived later and animals had not learned our habits, naivete might have been a kind of vulnerability, herds not yet reading our silhouettes as danger, predators not yet understanding how quickly our tools could turn the hunt around. That asymmetry does not make a villain, it sketches an encounter whose speed outpaced learning. Imagine the end of a lineage not as a single dramatic day, but as a winter with too many small costs. A thaw crusts over into ice, calves burn more fat to pour down to grass. A flood rearranges a crossing, a herd expends energy backtracking to a narrower ford and loses 2 old cows. A human group pressed by a late spring takes a few more individuals than planned because a storm is coming. Climate cools again for a decade and then warms unevenly. Favoured plants are out of step with calving by 2 weeks, just enough to matter when predators are also hungry. Multiply such small shortages by lifetimes, and the curve bends downward, not with malice, but with the arithmetic of margins. There were, of course, spectacles. Ice-dammed lakes broke now and then, blurting fresh water into river systems with a sound the earth must still remember. Fires ran across prairies and left black maps 100 miles long. A human hunting drive along a ridgeline ended in a tangle in the snow, and a cliff face where hoofprints tell of confusion. But most of the fading may have been quiet, a herd that did not return to a valley, a den that stayed empty one spring, a child who asked where the big ones had gone and got a careful answer and a shrug that meant the same thing both ways. What we lost with the bodies is not only mass. Big herbivores engineer landscapes, they trample and fertilize, they keep shrubs in check and let grasses compete in their airy sunlit way. They open gaps in young forests that become wildflower rooms for bees. They carry seeds inside them and drop those seeds where water is waiting. Big predators, too, arrange things moving grazers around, allowing saplings to grow where hooves do not linger, feeding scavengers at their leavings. Remove these, and the patchwork shifts, sometimes thickening into dark green, sometimes unraveling into scrub that catches snow into crusts that smaller grazers cannot break. Sometimes the world grows more crowded, and oddly emptier at once. And yet, not everything went. Bison persisted on the plains, moose learned the new forests, reindeer and caribou continued their long antlered sentences across northern lines. Elephants in Africa wrote patience into dry seasons and wet. Humans, too, learned restraint in many places. Taboos around taking females with calves, rules about when and where to hunt, strategies for switching prey when signs warned that a winter had cut too deep. Cultural memory carries quieter conservation than any law, a song that says not now, not this one, not here. There's an ache in this chapter, and it is healthy to feel it. But there's also a kind of responsibility that follows, to avoid flattening the past into a single cause, to honour evidence even when it resists a clean narrative, to hold overlapping truths at once. People are capable of love and hunger, climates can change quickly and slowly, animals can be both resilient and fragile in the same season. The end of the giants was not a fable, it was an intersection of forces, many of which still cross within us. Walk, for a moment along a river after first frost. Grass heads rattle softly, a beaver tail slaps once, warning, then stillness returns. In a bend where silt settles, tracks stipple the mud. Deer, fox, bird, a child's boot. On the bank above, the old trunk of a cottonwood shows the missing bark where elk rubbed antlers in a year. You were not there to see. No mammoth prints, no rhinoceros marks, but the absence is not empty. It is a space where we might imagine with care and then move forward with the gentleness imagination can teach. Stories of loss sometimes end there. Ours can move on. Because after the giants faded, another change gathered, a green tide that rose into their spaces, a reweaving of the world that would make room for new patterns, for the flowering of forests, for wetlands that would braid song into summer nights, for human gardens that would sometimes align with this new abundance and sometimes resist it. The cold loosened its hold, the map began to blur, then sharpen in greener ink, and the shore took a deep breath and walked inward. When the ice lets go, it does not fling the world into warmth. It relaxes its hand, edge by edge, margin by margin. The white steps back. Water speaks first, the high trickles gathering into rills, the rills weaving into brooks, the brooks rising into rivers that remember their broader beds, then unremember, carving new ones. Lakes appear where ice once pressed down, blue coins laid into over-deepened valleys, kettles fill with lilies, ponds gain frogs that sing at dusk in a language as old as Thor. Forests return not as a single wall, but as a procession. Pioneer trees, birch, aspen, willow, arrive early, quick with light seeds, quick to take advantage of sun on bare ground. Their leaves flicker like 1,000 small mirrors when wind moves through them, cooling the air just above the new soil. In their shade, seedlings that prefer gentler conditions, pines, spruces, oaks depending on where you stand, set their roots and learn the place. Shrubs stitch the understory. Moss pulls a soft green carpet over stones that ice left shining. Fungi thread an unseen internet that will, in time, let a tree feed another tree, will let a warning pass quietly from trunk to trunk. As green gathers, animals move their furniture. Reindeer retreat with the cold edge, finding summer in tundras that now bloom for a short, ecstatic season. Moose follow willow into wetlands and learn to dip their muzzles into dark water for lilies. Beavers, untroubled by the retreat of ice, set about problem-solving at valley scale, damming streams into ponds and ponds into chains of mirrored rooms where dragonflies write blue cursive. Birds return in flocks that look like weather, warblers making trees audible, geese drawing versagas across mornings that taste of leaf. The coast redraws itself with calm insistence. With ice stored as water again, the ocean rises, not overnight, but with a patience that still outruns a single house. Shores step inland, estuaries push salt farther upriver. Barrier islands reform, wander, dissolve, reform. In the far north, as the burden lifts, the land actually rises, old shorelines climbing hillsides into terraces, new harbours appearing where last year you had to drag the boat. In the far south, ice that once met the sea calms its carving, and lets penguins find rock where they had only snow. Reefs in warmer sweeps grow like crowded cities, building neighbourhoods of coral where fish paint their own flags. In some regions, this early Holocene warmth leans generous. We sometimes call a slice of it the Holocene thermal maximum, a mouthful that simply means summers in many places were milder to warmer than later millennia, though not everywhere, not every year. Monsoons in Africa and Asia likely strengthened under certain orbital arrangements. The Sahara, which we know as a book of sand, greened in wide chapters, lakes widened. Hippos, perhaps, wallowed where dunes now hold only wind. People painted these waters and these animals on stone that today looks out over dryness. Their art a mirror held up to a climate we do not live in any longer. Elsewhere, the greening meant peatlands, the patient building of wet soils that store centuries of plant breath in layers of brown. In the high north, thawed ground grew soft in summer, and sedges and moss laid down yearly thin blankets that, over time, became mattresses for cloud and crane. In the mid-latitudes, oak, elm and lime, linden formed mixed forests you could walk through in shade that felt like a hymn. In the Americas, prairies breathed fire as a normal conversation with summer lightning and human flame. Grass is answered by rooting deep and by seeding after burns, feeding bison, elk, antelope, and in time plows. People did not merely watch this return, they spoke back. In several places, almost certainly independently, groups began to garden the green. In the Fertile Crescent, wild cereals that had long been gathered were coaxed into steadier forms, seeds larger, stalks less eager to fling their grain to the wind. In what is now China, millets and later rice entered human calendars. In New Guinea's high valleys, taro and bananas took on the shape of partnership. In Mesoamerica, squashes and maize began their long braided conversation with cooks and soils. In the Andes, potatoes learned our taste for starch and generosity. These were not overnight inventions, they were centuries of noticing which seeds spilled where, which shoots tasted sweetest after rain, which fields repaid a fallow with double kindness. Villagers gathered along river edges that had settled into predictable moods. Houses learned the weather of a particular bend. Dogs kept watch while grain dried on mats. Children grew under trees that had names. Stories shifted a little too, more about seasons, less about routes, more about counting jars than counting miles. Yet mobility remained a virtue. Fields were rotated, herds moved, fishing camps reappeared with the calendar. No single lifeway pressed everything else aside. The Holocene offered many rooms. The green return brought insects in numbers that could make an evening hum. Bees, of course, doing the slow arithmetic of nectar and pollen, midges that taught swallows to throw commas into sunset, butterflies that made a meadow feel like a busy conversation. Along with them came the predators their abundance would support, bats tracing corkscrews in the dusk, dragonflies hunting the air like tiny jeweled falcons, spiders stringing silk between stalks that felt the wind and in their way, listened. Rivers, no longer held under the governance of ice, found their mature voices. Meanders tightened and loosened, floodplains built themselves up like layered bread, forests learned to bend and let go in high water and to stand and sift silt when floods receded. Salmon runs, where geography allowed, wrote a nutrient cycle that delivered ocean to forest each autumn through the medium of muscle and fin and patience, bears and eagles hauling bright bodies up valley corridors to feed trees. Not every green page was gentle. As sea rose, Doggerland's fields became shoals. A storm one autumn took a headland that had held for generations. In Southeast Asia, mangroves marched inland, some fishing grounds faded, others blossomed in new channels. In the Mediterranean, rains wandered, villages adapted to both wet decades and lean ones. In the Americas, prairie and woodland jockeyed along lines that shifted with fire use and lightning, with bison abundance and drought. The Holocene stability is real compared to the wild swings before, but within that stability are local improvisations that ask attention and offer beauty. The old cold still spoke. Glaciers clung in the high places and refilled in winters that enjoyed a particularly snowy mood. Rock flower from their melt-coloured lakes, milk blue. In late summer, a valley could feel like two seasons at once. Heat in the meadow, glacier breath coolness flowing down like waterless wind. Families brought children to put hands in that water, as if in a font, because to touch old ice melt is to feel time. It numbs the knuckles and clears the mind. And the animals? They wrote new arrangements. Where forests closed, open country giants bowed out, but forest elephants in Africa browsed in dappled shade, and boar rooted, and deer learned edges, meadow at dawn, understory at noon, riverbank at dusk. Wolves took this classroom in stride. Lynx, where they had room, padded the snow in winter and vanished into fern in summer. Where people set fields, wild cousins of their crops learned to follow, and birds learned that harvest leaves a kindness in stubble. Not harmony, never a single chord, but a layered piece in which dissonance resolves more often than it breaks. Somewhere around the middle of this warm epoch, humans aimed themselves more deliberately at engineering water and light. Canals wore mirror-bright paths through lowlands. Terraces thumbed mountains into green staircases. Fish weirs stitched rivers with clever fences that let small fish through and held elders for feast and ceremony. Fire was flicked with intention into meadows to keep them meadows. Forests were thinned with a tenderness that left the big old ones to anchor weather and story. Again, not everywhere, not all at once, but often enough that the planet began to carry our handwriting in bolder ink. Pause with me by a wet meadow at the end of a Holocene afternoon. The air smells of sun-warmed grass and a little mud. Crickets take up their evening practice. Swallows sweep low and lift at the last second, their wings whispering like silk. In the distance, someone laughs, then a dog answers briefly. Then both sounds melt into the general kindness. This too is the world the ice made by leaving. A generosity that seems ordinary until you remember what sat here, not so long ago, a mile of white, a sky that held its breath. We will not insist that the Holocene is the end of anything. It may be a pause, a warm paragraph in a longer cold book. The planet keeps its own counsel about such matters. For us, the green return gave room for 1,000 languages to sketch weather, for music to learn the pitch of wood and skin, for stories to thicken around hearths that did not have to be carried tomorrow. It also left traces of the ice within us. Rhythms we'll meet next in genes and in memory, in myths about floods and winters, in the comfort some of us still take from a window full of snow. Let evening fall. The last light slips under leaves and paints the underside of things gold. A frog says yes. Another frog says also yes. Somewhere upstream, a small glacier makes a sound like glass being breathed on, and the river receives it without fuss. Tomorrow the forest will open one more bud. Tomorrow too we will listen for the old heartbeat within the new warmth and treat it with respect. If the glaciers have melted back, why does the cold still feel familiar when snow begins to fall at night? Perhaps because the Ice Age didn't only sculpt valleys and coasts, it also left quiet traces in us, bones and blood, stories and songs, reflexes we barely notice. The evidence is soft, never absolute, but it suggests that our species walked through long winters often enough that winter left its handwriting on our minds and on our maps. Genes tell part of the tale, though they whisper more than they shout. Variants that help us process fat efficiently, that tweak how we store heat in brown adipose tissue, or that influence the shape of noses where air dries and freezes. These may have drifted or been favoured in colder corridors. Skin tones, hair textures, body proportions. Allen's and Bergman's rules are tendencies, not laws, yet they hint that bodies sometimes compact in cold, sometimes stretch in heat. None of this arrives as destiny. It arrives as a nudge, an option our ancestors tried on because the wind had a certain bite. Brains remember weather too, just without filing a report. Many of us feel calmer with a small contained flame nearby, as if a candle restores a perimeter our ancestors once built each evening. Many savour the hush that comes with snow, that soft insulation of sound that makes a city feel newly kind. We plan cupboards without thinking about it. Extra beans, an extra blanket, echoes of a season when being ready was a virtue that needed no name. Even our pace shifts in first frost. Steps become deliberate, eyes seek firm footing, ears listen for the small crackle that means ice is thin. Practice, inherited not in muscle but in habit. Culture carries thicker cords of memory. Myths from many places keep winter at their centre. Stories of a sun that leaves and must be coaxed back, of a long night that yields to feast, of a river that freezes because a spirit is grieving, of heroes who steal fire, not to hoard it, but to share. These are not footnotes to weather, they are social technologies, rituals that gather people when light is scarce, calendars that mark the deep middle so it does not swallow hope, recipes that make use of what keeps well, songs that lengthen the evening without emptying the pantry. Even where winters are mild, similar structures appear around drought and flood. The pattern is the point. Archaeologists find attention baked into tools and homes. Needle eyes grow smaller and more durable through late Pleistocene and early Holocene layers, as if tailoring grew ever more exact. Hearths are built with lips that control draft. Little windbreaks of stone shaped by hands that cared about smoke as much as flame. Storage pits are lined and marked with a friend's geometry. Stones placed in remembered order, so a cache isn't lost when snow makes a field look like a blank page. The genius is less invention than refinement, removing friction from survival until survival has room for beauty. Languages, too, seem to linger over winter's particulars. In many families of words, the terms for ice, frost, and wind branch like trees. There are words for snow that squeaks underfoot, and snow that swallows your step, for wind that steals heat, and wind that merely rearranges your hair, for the crust that forms after a thaw, and turns grazing into work. Some of these vocabularies are flamboyant in their variety. Others are modest but exact. What unites them is care, and care is a fossil that lasts as long as speech does. Foodways carry the same memory. Ferments flourish in cold, cabbage turned to brightness in jars, fish resting into gravlax, milk coaxed into cheeses that travel well and feed a winter. Broths that pull goodness from bones appear wherever fuel is dear, and nothing can be wasted. Fat is treated with respect because it is high-spirited energy that stays put. Sweets are saved for deep nights, not only to cheer but to concentrate calories when the sun is stingy. Even in warm climates, parallel strategies bloom, drying, smoking, pickling, the same instinct in different weather. And then there is the social architecture. The Ice Age seems to have favoured. Bands widened into networks, fragile alone but resilient in braid. Marriages tied families across valleys, so that one group's lean season could meet another's abundance with grace. Reciprocity became memory, and then became law song, enforced not by courts but by reputation. Gift and countergift kept trust elastic over distance. In some traditions, taboos around taking certain animals at certain times or from certain places likely served conservation long before anyone named it. When your grandchildren will face the same winter, thrift becomes affection stretched through time. Art bears winter's watermark without sorrow. The caves say as much. Animals painted into motion, hands stenciled as if to say we were here. Dots and lines that might be maps, might be chants. Carvings of figures smoothed by many fingers, charms perhaps, or simply the pleasure of shape when nights are long. Music made from bone and reed, survives in fragments but not in effect. One can almost hear the circular breathing that keeps a melody steady while someone else works by that pulse. Beauty was never icing, it was the warmth that made the rest sustainable. The Ice Age may also have trained our attention to edges, ecotones where two worlds meet and resources layer. River margins in winter where open water remains. South-facing slopes in spring where the first green whispers. Drip lines beneath conifers where snow thins. Caves with stable temperatures, reliable for storage or refuge. To love edges is to love optionality, and optionality is one of the quietest forms of safety. Of course, we are not only products of cold, our ancestry braided through forests and savannas, coasts and wetlands, our minds carry heat and rain, flood and famine. But the last 2 million years favoured again and again humans who could handle chill. That doesn't make us frostborn, it makes us adaptable to a fault sometimes, and at our best to a degree that feels like grace. If there is an ice age still inside us, perhaps it is not in a single gene or a single myth, but in a posture, heads up, listening for small changes, hands skilled at mending as well as making, hearts convinced that a tiny circle of warmth can change the emotional weather of a room. In a noisy century, those remain winter tools that work in summer too. Will there be another? The cautious answer offered with humility is yes, someday. Unless our species alters the planet's long rhythm so deeply that the pattern itself shifts. Ice ages are not single storms. They are habits of a planet shaped by the geometry of orbit and tilt, by feedbacks of ice and cloud and ocean. Those celestial cycles continue, slow and sure. On a timescale of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, the ingredients for future ice remain on the shelf. But timescales matter. The same curves in the heavens that dim high-latitude summers a little every so often are competing. For now, with greenhouse gases we have released in a couple of centuries, carbon pulled from old rock and plant, lit like a sudden bonfire, that brightens winters, softens spring thaws into rain, and keeps nights from losing heat as fast as they did. Many researchers suggest this added warmth may delay the next glacial chapter, well beyond the dates the sky alone would write. Perhaps we've pushed the bookmark forward, perhaps we've changed the story arc. With so many moving parts, clouds, aerosols, ice dynamics, we keep our voice soft. It helps to remember scale. A future ice age, if it comes, would not descend in a week, it would announce itself in long breaths. Summers that fail to melt last winter's snow at certain latitudes, ice sheets nursing from those leftovers until they can sustain themselves, albedo turning the dial a little cooler each year, seas stepping back by meters, and then tens of meters. At human speed, that's many, many generations. Time enough to move cities, to learn new coasts, to teach children different maps. The point isn't to be complacent, it's to see that planetary cold, when it arrives, is measured in patience. Our present, by contrast, is quick. Glaciers that survived the long millennia are retreating within lifetimes. Seasons are blurring in ways that farmers and fishers can recite, not as politics but as weather. Blossom before frost, rain where snow once banked reservoirs, rivers swollen at odd times. Sea level rises not by the meter per century yet, but by enough that a grandmother can tell you which marsh has drowned since her own childhood. We live inside a warm experiment of our own making, and the ethics of that experiment ask for more care than fear. What does the Ice Age teach us about this? First, that Earth's climate is capable of both stability and surprise. The long Pleistocene was full of steady state punctuated by lurches, the Younger Dryas arriving like a sharp intake of breath, Heinrich events littering the ocean floor with stones from inland. Second, that resilience is distributed. Forests remember, prairies remember, wetlands remember, people remember, through culture when we choose to. Third, that small choices multiplied over landscapes matter, where fires are set and when, which crossings are used, which animals are spared, which seeds are saved. Those are levers we still hold. It also teaches scale of kindness. The camps that survived winters best were the ones that planned for neighbours, the ones braided by reciprocity, ready to shelter travellers, skilled at saying take what you need and come back in spring with news. That isn't romantic, it's practical. In a changing climate, information is a currency that keeps children fed and elders warm, and generosity is a technology that compounds. A map shared, a tool taught, a seed swapped. These are climate adaptations as surely as walls and wells. Could there be a deep future in which ice returns even after our brief hot flare? Possibly. If greenhouse gases eventually ebb and orbital patterns line up, the planet might drift back into its older habit. Coastlines would widen again. Beringia would reappear as a pale, cold country. Forests would retreat where snow lingers. New generations would learn the old words for wind. If that feels melancholy, it might help to remember how many kinds of beauty the cold made. Fjords and loess, steppe and aurora, art on stone and songs in caves. A future cold would make different beauties and different ethics to match. Or perhaps the arc bends another way. Perhaps we choose to steady the climate near a gentler warmth, slowly, with intention, by calming the fire we lit and letting forests, oceans and soils relearn their softer breath. That path is less about conquering nature and more about matching the patience of the systems we've jostled. It asks for arithmetic. Less carbon out, more carbon held, energy drawn from light and wind and heat beneath our feet, cities shaped to be comfortable without prodigal flame. It asks for storytelling, too, because futures are built from what we believe is possible. Either way, humility seems appropriate. The Ice Age story is a lesson in proportion. We are clever, astonishingly so, and also small under the aurora. We can dam rivers and stitch continents with fiber and summon food from winter fields. We cannot command the tilt of Earth or the deep swirl of currents. We can nudge feedbacks for worse and for better. We can decide to be the kind of ancestor someone in a different climate, whether warmer or colder, thanks in quiet ways for a marsh that still breathes, for a forest that still shades, for a village plan that held when one storm in 1,000 arrived as it always will. Picture one last scene, a winter night, present or future, stars hard and bright, breath turning to brief ghosts. Somewhere far off, ice moves with a sound like a building sighing. Somewhere nearer, a home lamp burns. Oil, tallow, solar, battery, the fuel is detail. Inside, voices murmur. Someone tells a child about reindeer that used to pass within sight. Someone else, older, remembers a river that used to freeze so thick you could pull fish through a hole and never hear the water. The child listens, then asks for a story with mammoths. The elder smiles. We tell these tales not to live in the past, but to carry forward its lessons. Go together, prepare for weather, keep beauty close, let wonder guide work.